I've been really looking forward to this particular conversation because I think the topic is both so interesting and so important. So Bill, let's start with that bigger picture. And obviously, we could approach the issue of hunger and food security from a lot of directions. You've done the majority of your work in Africa, so we can maybe use that at least as a starting point and as an example. So what is the current state of affairs as you think about issues of food scarcity, famine, food security right now? How would you describe the situation that exists in Africa?
Yeah, great question. So there's about 800 million people in the world today that are food insecure, which means they don't have enough calories to lead an active and healthy life, and around 2 billion people who suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. In absolute numbers, there are actually more people in South Asia that suffer from hunger, but if you look at sort of a fraction of the population that's food insecure, the highest numbers are in a variety of African countries. Hunger had been on the decline. We've seen some upticks the last couple of years, which is disconcerting. And that's related to a number of factors. Sometimes it's political insecurity, and so people may know that Yemen in particular is a difficult situation now. And there's also growing concern of climate change and how that's impacting agricultural production.
So the standard explanation for understanding of the causes of hunger and famine has to do with a sense that people just aren't growing enough food to sustain themselves, that if there is a famine or a drought, that they just can't grow enough food, the food that they grow runs out. I know from our conversations that the reality is a little bit more complicated, and the actual causes of why people don't have enough to eat are not as simple or as obvious as sometimes what people think.
Yeah, so what I find fascinating is how old these ideas are. So you can go back to the colonial period, and the common explanation is that famine and hunger had to do with a climatic event like a drought. It had to do with overpopulation, or it had to do with inefficient farming practices. I think what that obfuscates is that in the colonial period and then moving forward in the post-colonial period, you had local farming systems that were sort of radically reshaped by colonial powers. So in a number of Sahelian African countries where I work, the farming systems there were adapted to highly variable climatic conditions. You just knew that 1 out of every 2 years would be a drought. So these were subsistence oriented. You'd be growing food for your own family, and when there was a surplus, you would store that surplus so that you could deal with a shortfall in a drought year. Well, the British and the French colonial powers often implemented a head tax. The only way to pay that tax was with cash, and so you either had to grow cash crops or migrate for wage labor. And so you see these, what had historically been subsistence-oriented systems, becoming increasingly focused on sort of cash crop production or food crops for the market, and people don't save food anymore. And then that process has really continued in the post-colonial period. And so I think for me the key message is that our social structure conditions how we experience the environment, how we experience something like a drought. And you can't just look at that exogenous sort of climatic event as the main driver. You have to think about how society is structured.
Mm-hmm. So you would question the assumption that we don't have enough food because we have too many people, that it's more complicated than that.
Yes, and there's a long history, dating back to the work of Thomas Malthus, who basically posited with no empirical evidence to support it that population increases at a faster rate than food production. There's a lot of evidence that suggests the converse. As population densities increase, we improve yields, we produce more food, and really the crux of the problem is that people's surplus production is being taken over by other operators in the system.
So a lot of people have, over the last few decades, spent a lot of time thinking about this problem and have tried to ameliorate it with good intentions, including the Gates Foundation from this area, including Kofi Annan, who's been very involved in what's been called the Green Food Revolution in Africa. And I know that it's one of the subjects of your research. The book talks about critical perspectives on it. And by that, I think you mean both kind of investigative, but also some criticism of the approach. So what could be wrong with the Gates Foundation coming in and spending billions of dollars trying to alleviate hunger in Africa?
I laud the Gates Foundation for their good intentions. I also think we have to understand that their worldview shapes and frames how they approach the problem. So I want to step back in time slightly to the first Green Revolution, because I think it helps us understand the new Green Revolution for Africa. So I'm sure many in the audience are familiar with this period in sort of the 50s and 60s when Norman Borlaug spearheaded the Green Revolution, so hybrid seeds, pesticides, fertilizers, in an attempt to improve food production in the global south. That was shaped in part by concerns about global population growth, impending famine, but it was also very much shaped by the Cold War. Basically, hungry people are going to riot and turn socialist. So there was a particular geopolitical context here. That initiative is considered to be successful in terms of certain criteria. They did boost crop yields, particularly for wheat and rice in Asia and Latin America. And the conventional wisdom is that that first Green Revolution bypassed Africa. And so I think particularly in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 global food crisis, when we saw this big spike in food prices, there's been this very concerted effort to sort of replicate that Green Revolution experience in the African context. I think it's important to be aware of what didn't go so well with the first Green Revolution. There were a lot of environmental issues. Lots of dams were built for intensive rice production. And there were what we call the pesticide treadmill problem. Basically, if you use more and more pesticides to get the same effect because insect populations are developing resistance. I'm concerned that some of those lessons from the Green Revolution haven't been taken on board, but I think more fundamentally, the new Green Revolution is a very sort of productionist approach. If we improve food production, we will address hunger. And a key insight of a scholar, Amartya Sen, who is an economist who won the Nobel Prize for his work, is that hunger is rarely about an absolute lack of food. It's about poor people not having access to food. And I'm concerned that this new Green Revolution for Africa is not thinking about the poorest of the poor, the people who are hungry, and how they can benefit from this very sort of technological approach, and one that's also influenced by a strong sort of market orientation.
So let's talk a little bit about the research that you've been doing and that Julia has been involved with. Julia, you spent 2 summers in Burkina Faso with Bill. So maybe you could both talk a little bit about let's start with what questions you were asking when you entered that research, and then maybe we could talk a little bit about what your takeaways have been to this point. I know it's still in process.
Would you like to start?
So I'll just say a few things, and then I really want to give Julia a chance here. This New Green Revolution for Africa approach, there's actually, it's well-intentioned, but we don't have a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that it really works. And so the idea is that you're going to give people improved seeds, pesticides, fertilizers. They're going to boost their yields. They're going to sell these on the market. They're going to take that money and they're going to buy more inputs so they can do this again. But then ideally, this is going to lead to more cash flow and better nutrition for the household. So in Burkina Faso, there's a project that's been funded for the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, focused on rice production in southwestern Burkina Faso. And we were particularly interested in how is this impacting the dietary diversity and the food security of women, female farmers that are involved in rice production. And in this area, traditionally, women do grow rice. And so we had a sample of 165 women. Some are involved in these projects, some are not, looking at how this is impacting their welfare.
Yeah, so my project was sort of nested within that and trying to understand if there is an issue going on with this project that's negatively impacting their nutrition, sort of in theory. Why might that be? And one of the things that sort of occurred to me was foraging, which is a really important way that farmers access food. And I had a lot of sort of one-on-one experience with that in Madagascar when I was studying abroad. When I did similar research looking at nutrition and found that foraging was pretty much the number one way that people were able to have food when their crops failed. Mm-hmm. So my project looked at how much people forage, what they're doing with the stuff they forage. Are they eating it? Are they selling it? And sort of tried to gauge about how often they eat it, and then understand how those indicators are then potentially having an effect on their nutrition. Mm-hmm. And what I found is that there is a positive effect on nutrition, specifically for dietary diversity. We had 2 different indicators of nutrition, and that's what you would expect because people get a lot of leafy greens from their natural environment. Mm-hmm. Whereas the bulk of their calories come from agriculturally produced food. So then sort of a second question within that was whether the project and their involvement in that project is then influencing their foraging. And we found that in this particular case, that wasn't very true. And that really goes back to the efficacy of the implementation of that particular project, because we found that it wasn't going quite as anyone would have hoped.
So I'm just going to take this in a different direction for a moment and just ask you a little bit about your story. When you arrived at Macalester, did you expect that you would spend a semester studying in Madagascar and 2 summers in Burkina Faso? And if not, how did you get from your entry point to that point?
Yeah, I definitely did not. I arrived at Macalester thinking that I would be on the pre-med track, do a bio major. That was not the case. I ended up majoring geography. I still minored.
Was it this guy's fault?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I'd taken human geography in high school, but it didn't really enter my mind that was even a major until I got to Mac, where there's a pretty strong geography department. And I was in Bill's first year course, which definitely impacted things. And yeah, I heard about the opportunity. I definitely wanted to study abroad. That wasn't a big surprise that I ended up studying abroad. And, I saw it as a way to get research experience and, more importantly, go abroad to a country that's pretty difficult to travel to on your own. And so I took it.
And what did you learn, aside from the specific research project, just about the nature of living and studying in a culture that's not your own?
Well, it's hard. It's hard to do. And I was only there for about a month and a half each summer, so that I think made it particularly difficult because you're just drop down and you have to understand a lot of cultural norms. There was a lot of trial and error with our questions. When we first started, we'd ask a particular question about maybe their wealth or what people own or when they ate their meal, and our translator would be like, don't ask that. That's ridiculous. Why? Yeah.
Right.
And so you just kind of have to muddle through that. Yeah.
So, Bill, the work is still in process. So, at this point, what would you identify as the most significant takeaways
Sure.
from what you've done? And what are the key questions that remain to be answered for you?
Yeah. So before I answer that question, I just want to really applaud and recognize Julia's contribution to this project. I think we often think of faculty as sort of all-knowing, and they're the teachers and they have the answers, and we learn a lot from our students, and oftentimes they're the ones that are teaching us. So Julia was really the one who brought foraging to my attention. For those of you who you may remember from school, we think of, there are hunters and gatherers, and then we have the first agricultural revolution. We discover agriculture, and then the second and the third agricultural revolutions, and that becomes increasingly more intensive and so-called better approaches. And what I think that obfuscates is that these systems coexist, right? And so farmers, foraging and hunting never completely went away, and that this is a really important part of people's nutrition. Something like, baobab leaves, which women are collecting when they're either going to the farm fields or coming home, are this rich source of iron and micronutrients. And it's really Julia that put that on the map for me. And I think, when this project is done, that will be a significant sort of contribution. So to answer your question, I think...
Now that you've made Julia's mother very, very happy.
I think what we're finding in this particular case is that this project is not really having that much impact, either positively or negatively, on women's nutrition. But for those of you who've done field research, oftentimes what you set out to look at and examine and think you're going to find, you end up finding other paths that are in fact more interesting. So for example, in Burkina Faso, we have what they call this distinct hungry season. So many farmers don't produce enough food to last the whole year until the next harvest. And so there's this 3 or 4 month period before the next harvest, which is really, really difficult. And so we are doing both dietary diversity and food security surveys in the hungry season and then after the harvest. And what we're finding is that in the hungry season, their dietary diversity is actually relatively good, much better than you would expect. And a lot of it has to do with these foraging resources. Their food security, their access to sort of absolute number of calories is not so great because they're running out of grains to consume. That then flips after the harvest, right? They have access to a lot more calories, but because a lot of these forage foods are things that leaf out, or some insects populations, you see a bloom of these when the rains come. The harvest is after the rains, and so these forage foods are harder to get a hold of. And so dietary diversity is lower after the harvest.
So I guess I want to ask you whether you're optimistic about the future, but let me ask it in a slightly different way initially. If you could sit down with the people at the Gates Foundation, I mean, obviously they have enormous resources to bring to this challenge. What are the things that you would change about the way they are thinking about it in order to have a more positive impact on food insecurity?
I believe the philanthropists of the world and the Gates Foundation mean well. And I admire the work they're doing. But I would want to offer a constructive critique and sort of complicate the story. And so I think, and this makes a lot of sense, Bill Gates, very successful entrepreneur, has a sort of capitalist understanding of the world. He thinks that the market is inherently beneficial. So if you integrate subsistence farmers into the marketplace, from his worldview, his perspective, they're going to make money and they're going to invest in nutrition and they're going to do better. And he also has this strong belief in technology. And I guess my point would be maybe that approach works for some farmers. Based on previous research I've done, it tends to be wealthier farmers that helps out. But for the poorest of the poor, the people that are hungry, we have to think about this differently. We have to come up with solutions that, for example, you don't have to take a loan out in order to access that technology, because farming is a very risky business and you can quickly become indebted and your situation can worsen if you're not careful. And so, there are lots of, I'm a fan of agroecology, thinking about farming systems as ecological systems, and how can we beneficially integrate different crops. So the classic example would be a legume that fixes nitrogen. So, beans that fix nitrogen and help a grain crop. Or thinking about, sort of healthy insect populations and how we can manage those in a way that pests don't get out of control. And so I would push, I think, the Gates Foundation to think of sort of multiple systems, multiple approaches, complicate their sort of approach to
And are there groups taking the approach that you described?
There are smaller scale nonprofits, NGOs, that take more of an agroecological approach. And I think the critique of that is that you need to scale up, you need to get bigger. I think increasingly you see these sort of public-private sector approaches, and for the private sector to get involved, they need to make some money. And the problem is there's very little money to be made in feeding the poorest of the poor, in helping them find solutions where you don't actually have to buy something.
And just to piggyback on top of that, I think another big component is gender, and the poorest of the poor largely being women. And when you talk to, at least in our study area, when we would talk to people, people would joke, oh, well, that doesn't work because that gives men money and they just go buy beer. And But there's legitimate research that shows
That's what men do, yeah.
And so, understanding, there's just not a one solution fits all
Right.
kind of deal. You have to understand the cultural landscape and understand how gender fits into that, as well as other components and who the poorest of the poor are.
So I can't resist wrapping up this portion of the program before we move to your questions by just asking you to talk a little bit about the food, agriculture, and society concentration, because I've told Bill this before, I think it's so cool. And I love the fact that the problem that we're talking about, which is clearly an enormous one, ultimately is going to be solved by smart people who are well educated about it. And we have this program that really Bill and students were instrumental in pushing. And that's quite distinctive in food, agriculture, and society. So just, I'll allow you to brag a little bit about it.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about that program and how we're trying to educate Macalester students to actually deal with this issue.
So the genesis of this was the 2012 International Roundtable, which was on food and agriculture. This was an odd year. We were between deans at the IGC, and the students got a little rowdy, and they wrote a call to action. And part of that call to action was to have a program, an interdisciplinary program on food and agriculture. So it's really the students that drove that. We subsequently had a series of meetings, put together a proposal, which 2 years ago just barely squeaked by the curriculum committee. That was actually a harder process than the faculty vote of the full faculty. And they were just hounding me about, are we going to have enough courses? And Arjun Gunaratne, Amy Damon, and I, my co-conspirators, basically argued, if you build it, they will come. And we now have 10 core courses across a range of departments. I'm very excited that this term we have 4 new courses that have never been offered before. There's a food chemistry course, a food justice course in sociology, one on food and farming and environmental studies. And I really believe that liberal arts college students that can think critically, that can think across different disciplines, these are hope for reinventing the food system in the United States and globally. Historically, that's been the purview of public land-grant universities. I think very sadly, with declines in public funding and increasing sort of corporate funding for those schools, their sort of vision of how you address hunger has really been narrowed down to a productionist approach. And our students, I think, think much more creatively about this. And so it's an exciting program. We're seeing increasing numbers of students, and I'm very hopeful for what they're going to go on and do after they leave MAC.
That's sort of the appetizer, and now we want to give you an opportunity to ask questions. We have a microphone on each side of the room.
So more and more of the world's population are not farmers. More and more of the world's population are living in cities. And oftentimes the poorest of the poor don't have access to farming. Do you have any information on how those green agricultural programs affect the people who are not farmers, who are living in urban areas or who otherwise don't have access to farming?
Yeah, so for the urban poor, there are obviously 2 key variables. One is the cost of food, and the other is income. And so food insecurity correlates very highly with poverty. And so in places where you've had successful poverty alleviation efforts, where people have access to employment, they tend to do better food-wise. Interestingly, I think, where I work in many African cities, you have a dynamic sort of urban agricultural sector. And I think that's particularly in areas where you have, underemployment or unemployment. This is a way for people to get direct access to food, particularly the types of food that you could grow in a backyard garden, vegetables, which are, an important source of micronutrients, and they're a lot of times they're expensive too if you buy them in markets.
I imagine that natural food systems and our agricultural systems have evolved over a long period of time, and I'm wondering what impact climate change will have, and with changing climate and weather patterns, I imagine changing much more quickly than they ever have in the history of the world. Can our agricultural systems adapt fast enough, and how do you see that happening?
It's a huge challenge. I have a colleague that argues that really we should be looking to African farmers because they have been dealing with highly variable rainfall patterns, difficult rainfall situations far longer than the rest of us. And they've been proven to be sort of highly adaptable. And so I do think we have a lot to learn from them. In some cases, people are arguing for more irrigation. I think the challenge with irrigation is that it tends to marginalize a lot of people when you build an irrigation work, and a smaller number of people benefit from that. I don't want to sugarcoat this. I do think climate change is a very sort of significant challenge, and our agricultural systems are going to have to change to deal with that. And that may mean changing the types of crops we grow, growing crops that are more drought tolerant. Maize or corn is become the dominant crop in a lot of parts of the world, and that's a very needy crop in terms of soil nutrients and rainfall. Particularly, it's an open pollinator, and if you don't get rain in this particular period, that's a big problem. So, thinking about sorghum, millet, other types of grains that are more drought tolerant.
I was wondering about, we've been talking a lot about macro perspectives and about, what's more macro than, 9 to 10 billion people in 31 years. And the WHO and the World Bank and all these big organizations that have a lot of effect in dictating how we grow food in the global south. But I was wondering if you had any stories or if you could speak to ways in which individual farmers or individual communities deal with these global powers and how they sort of might be able to reclaim the broader systems that they are a part of.
Ilsa, it's great to see you. Ilsa was in Julia's first year class, so it's got to stick together. So there's a movement known as food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is it's a political stance. It basically says that farmers need to be able to control the technologies that they're using to produce food. In the West African context, you have farmers' unions, which historically these farmers across different communities were working together because they grew the same cash crop. But it's increasingly you see them working together with food crops. And now you're seeing farmers' unions that are working across national boundaries in sort of a global peasants movement under the banner of sort of food sovereignty. And so that's sort of a grassroots political movement that is bubbling up from the bottom. But I think at the individual level, we often forget that farmers are scientists, and farmers like to experiment. And so a lot of farmers, in a corner of their field, they are trying different things every year. And I can't tell you the number of times I've come across farmers who, they have come up with this sort of unique combination that they've been experimenting with over time. And they have their own sort of informal seed networks, and they share good seeds and approaches with other farmers. But that's completely sort of illegible to the outside world because this is not a sort of a cash network. They're not buying and selling these.
I agree, we all waste food. I waste food. I have a garden. I don't always get everything picked. And here in Seattle, there are many food deserts. And I wonder if in your work you have thought about what governments can do. What can the mayor of Seattle do, or the citizens of Seattle do, to alleviate some of this problem? Is there a political solution? These are urban people, obviously, and not farmers. We have wonderful farmers markets here, by the way. But still, food deserts. What can we do?
Well, I guess the first thing that comes to mind, my sister, she runs this nonprofit that is a school bus that drives to different food deserts and sells really cheap produce from that bus because they have connections at the market, they can get low prices, and they don't have the overhead cost of a grocery store. So I think solutions like that, it's a Band-Aid, but I think they can get somewhere, and kind of being a little more creative about how you do that. And I know that's especially important for the elderly, like if there's a big retirement community and people aren't mobile, can't get out of their homes. That's very, very important.
It comes down to the same fundamental issue as when we talk about access to health care or access to housing, which is the growing inequality of income distribution, which creates inequality of access to a whole variety of things, whether it's food or health care or housing.
Poverty is at the root of this. I just read a book by Jahi Chappelle. It's called Beginning to End Hunger, and it's about the experience in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. And it's a great case study of an initiative that began in the early 90s of, they established what they called Restaurante Populaire. So these were kitchens that anyone could go into Everyone had to pay, but it was a minimum, very affordable price, so there wasn't a social stigma attached to this. And it was healthy food that was made from scratch, and they built up this network, so increasingly the ingredients, the fresh vegetables, were sourced from neighboring farms. This was combined with a really robust school meal program where, and this is hard to imagine in the US, but they actually had staff that prepared the meals in the schools using fresh ingredients. And so I think it's, we can tackle this problem without that many resources at the end of the day. It just takes political will to do something like they did in Brazil. And there they saw a 70% decrease in under 5 infant mortality. They saw dramatic reductions in diabetes, which are often related to poor diet. And so if we're willing to put a few resources into this, we can tackle these problems.
There's a lot of discussion, obviously, about the trade-offs between herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, and so on. So is there a role for organic gardening in solving this problem?
I think the critique is that organic farming is all well and good, but it can't feed the world, right? We can't do this on a large scale. There's actually an active debate there. And so agroecology, which is a nascent field, it's actually extremely well developed in places like Cuba, and they had to do it out of desperation because of a long-standing blockade there. They've actually, they've had amazing yields using organic techniques, using intelligent combinations of plants and compost and controlling pests. And so I think it's a fallacy that, we can do rigorous scientific research and figure out other ways to boost production than using lots of fossil fuels. And if you look at sort of energy input, energy output, the conventional ag systems we've produced are actually highly inefficient. We're putting so much energy into these things to get a little out. And so some of these organic systems are much more productive. It hasn't been a priority in the US Academy to sort of have robust research on this topic. And so I don't want to suggest that that's all we do, right? But it has been so much slanted towards one way of doing agriculture that I think there's a lot that could be done in this more organic or agroecological approach.
So I'm very interested about the meat consumption that you had mentioned and kind of the ripple effect of how if we change meat consumption locally, if you could help tie the dots of how that can help feed the world. And also, I'm a physician, and so I talk a lot about low red meat diets, and there are so many barriers for so many people to do that. Even though the evidence is so clear about health benefits as well as environmental and lowering our carbon footprint. And so I'm just kind of curious if there are system issues or policy issues where people are addressing that and trying to have that kind of greater good imposed upon the individual need to eat meat, if there are places where that is happening and if it has been successful.
As meat consumption is increasing globally, we are finding, an increasingly large fraction of our grain production that's being used to produce beef or hogs or chicken. And it's in Minnesota, I think it's like 90% of all the grain produced doesn't go directly to people. It ends up in animals that then people consume. There would just be a lot more grain out there if we were not consuming as much meat, and grain markets are interconnected around the world. And so maybe that doesn't, the corn we produce in Minnesota doesn't end up in Burkina Faso, but because those markets are interlinked, it has an impact on price and supply.
I guess I feel like more and more how one cooks with different ingredients is becoming an elite sort of knowledge, or a top 1% kind of knowledge. milk comes from the carton and meat comes from the grocery store. And I'm wondering if there's a role in the U.S. society around the stewardship of the knowledge around food, if there's a loss there that is leading to some of the excesses or the things that we're not doing well in our own backyard.
I have an answer for that, but I want to ask Julia what your impressions of the cooking culture was amongst students when you were at Mac.
I guess it depended. I feel like there was sort of, once you are out of the dorms, there's sort of a subset of the student population that continues to eat at Cafe Mac regularly because it's easy. And then there's a subset that cooks for themselves, and I feel like, I know there are a few different ideas about getting people together and sharing meals, and there's definitely a strong culture, not, throughout the population, but kind of a subculture, I guess, where food and cooking is really important. I also think there are issues with that, within MAC, and then as, part of the world generally, and the US specifically, with kind of an elitism around cooking and eating healthy food, what is healthy, and, not everyone wants to have a kale smoothie for breakfast every day, or, and that's not culturally appropriate for a lot of people, and or it just tastes bad. Yeah, I think part of the conversation around healthy food in the U.S., is understanding the elitism in that term.
So when I first started teaching at Mac in 2002, I didn't sense a lot of interest in food and agriculture. I think that really took off after Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma and some other books. And so my sense amongst our students, which is an elite group admittedly, is there is a lot of interest in food and cooking. I think for low-income people, one of the key constraints is time. So I'll give you an example. Some research we did in Mali, what we're finding is that when people move to urban areas, they give up traditional grains like millet and sorghum, which actually have more protein, but they're more labor intensive to prepare. And increasingly they're switching over to rice. And the sad thing is, a lot of it is imported broken rice from Asia. And there's actually been some research that's shown that some of this rice had been in countries' food security stocks, so it had been in silos for 20 to 30 years, and then they dump it on the market, and it gets shipped to places like Africa, and it has almost no nutritional content. But the female cooks we interviewed in Bamako, the capital of Mali, they like this rice because it's really quick to prepare. You put it in a pot, you boil the water. Because it's so old and dry, it fluffs up so much, it increases in volume. And so it's a labor-saving technology. And so Julia brought up gender issues earlier. I think as populations become more urban, as women are working more, as the opportunity costs of cooking increase, this is going to be a real challenge. And so how do you figure out how to sort of more time efficiently prepare, healthy food?
Something I think we haven't talked about in this conversation yet is just how dependent we are, at least in the United States, on agricultural workers to harvest all of this food. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on maybe where you think the United States at least is going with immigration policy being what they are, and compensation and just equity issues related to those who pick our food and how we consume it.
Every fall, I take my students in my People, Agriculture, and the Environment class. We go to an area near Somerset, Wisconsin, in northwest Wisconsin, and we have a collaborative relationship with a CSA farm there, but we spend time with a conventional maize and soybean farmer. And labor is a huge issue. Less so for grain and vegetable farmers, but especially for the dairy farmers. So the dairy farmers in Wisconsin are just getting hammered right now because of restrictions on immigration. Because the dairy industry, there are just some processes that are really hard to mechanize. You need labor. A lot of native-born Americans just aren't willing to do this type of labor. And so the irony is this is part of the current administration's base, a lot of these rural inhabitants in the farming area, yet the policies are just killing the farm sector. Not the tariff wars, the restrictions on immigration. I don't see how it can continue in this way, because you need this labor.
There'll be an opportunity after the session to talk with Bill and Julia, but please join me meanwhile in thanking them.